Created with Podmate.
Have you ever wondered how a young carpenter from a backwater province, executed by the most brutal empire on earth as a state criminal, ended up having his execution device worn as gold jewelry by millions of people today? It sounds completely bizarre when you look at it that way, right? The cross was a symbol of absolute terror, a graphic warning to anyone challenging Roman authority. But within a few centuries, that terrifying weapon of state-sponsored humiliation was flipped on its head and turned into an emblem of ultimate cosmic triumph. It's a process historians call a redemptive inversion, and it completely reshaped the Western world. To understand how this happened, we have to travel back to the 1800s when scholars first started asking a radical question: can we separate the historical figure of Jesus from the theological traditions that grew around him? Today, there's actually a robust scholarly consensus. Almost every mainstream historian agrees. Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person who lived and breathed in first-century Judea. This isn't just a matter of faith. It's built on verified anchor events that historians of all backgrounds agree on: his baptism, his public ministry in Galilee, and his brutal execution under Pontius Pilate. But Judea at the time wasn't some peaceful, unified country. It was a massive powder keg of religious and political divisions. Therefore, to understand Jesus, we have to look at the groups competing for influence. You had the Pharisees, who were deeply devout but split into rival schools, the strict house of Shammai and the far more lenient, compassionate house of Hillel. Jesus actually shared a lot of common ground with the Hillelites, but his radical inclusion of outcasts and his focus on pure compassion quickly set him apart from the mainstream. And then you had the Sadducees, the wealthy priestly elite running the temple, who cooperated with Rome to keep their power. To them, any populist movement was an existential threat. Throw in the Zealots, who wanted a violent, bloody revolution against the Romans, and the Essenes, an apocalyptic desert sect waiting for a cosmic war, and you get a society fractured by intense tension. Jesus' message of a peaceful spiritual kingdom frustrated the militants, but it deeply alarmed the established political authorities. Now, some skeptics used to claim that this entire story was a later myth, pointing out that we didn't have physical proof of key players like Pontius Pilate or the high priest Caiaphas, but modern archaeology has completely changed that landscape. In 1961, archaeologists dug up the Pilate stone in Caesarea, proving Pilate was exactly who the Gospels said he was: the prefect of Judea. And then, in 1990, they discovered the highly ornate bone box of Joseph Caiaphas himself. It's like the dust of the Levant keeps verifying these historical figures. Even more striking, for years skeptics argued that crucified victims were never given a proper burial, but were just thrown into mass graves. But in 1968, researchers found a first-century heel bone with a massive iron nail still driven through it, buried in a family tomb. Therefore, we have direct forensic evidence of Roman crucifixion practices matching the biblical narrative. And recently, a 3rd-century mosaic was uncovered explicitly calling Jesus divine, showing how early these core beliefs were physically cemented into history. And it's not just physical artifacts. We also have independent, non-Christian literary accounts written by writers who had absolutely no reason to make this stuff up. The Roman historian Tacitus, who despised Christianity, documented that Christus was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. He wrote this in his Annals around 116 AD. Then you have Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and the Jewish historian Josephus, all verifying details of Jesus' life, his execution, and the shocking speed at which his followers multiplied. There's even a letter from a Syrian philosopher named Mara bar Serapion, written shortly after, who laments the execution of the Jews' wise king and notes that his teachings lived on. So we have this massive pile of evidence. But how did his life actually end? It was through a fascinating, high-stakes collision of legal jurisdictions. You see, Jesus was first hauled before the Jewish Sanhedrin. They wanted him dead for false prophecy and blasphemy, but under Roman occupation, they lacked the legal authority to execute anyone. Therefore, they had to pivot. When they brought him to the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, they completely changed the charges. They didn't mention blasphemy. Instead, they accused him of high treason and sedition against the emperor, claiming he called himself a king and told people not to pay taxes. For Pilate, this was a matter of state security. He didn't care about Jewish theology, but he did care about maintaining the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. So, to prevent a massive riot during the volatile Passover festival, Pilate made a cold, calculated political move and condemned Jesus to the cross. The sign above his head, the King of the Jews, was his actual political charge. But the story doesn't end at the cross. In fact, that's where the real trouble for the Roman Empire began. At first, Rome saw the early Christians as just another Jewish sect, which meant they enjoyed the legal protections granted to ancient Judaism. But as the church grew and welcomed non-Jews, it lost that legal shield. It was suddenly classified as an illicit, dangerous superstition. This created a massive, deadly conflict. The Roman Empire required its citizens to participate in the imperial cult and offer sacrifices to the emperor to ensure the favor of the gods. But Christians, being strict monotheists, absolutely refused. To the Romans, this wasn't just a religious choice, it was treason and atheism. So the Roman magistrates gave them a simple choice: recant, burn a pinch of incense to the emperor, or face execution. The resulting persecutions were local and sporadic, but incredibly brutal. At the same time, pagan intellectuals launched fierce written attacks. A philosopher named Celsus mocked the movement, claiming Jesus was the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier and had learned magic in Egypt. He ridiculed Christians for appealing to the poor, slaves, and women, calling it a religion for the ignorant. In response, early Christian defenders like Justin Martyr and Origen fought back with pen and paper. Justin argued that Christians were actually the empire's most peaceful, law-abiding citizens. They used Greek philosophy to frame their faith as the ultimate rational truth, transforming a persecuted movement into an intellectual powerhouse. But the real engine behind their growth was sociological. It was the way they lived. While Roman society was deeply hierarchical and discarded the weak, the early church was radically egalitarian. It protected women, banned infanticide, and treated slaves as equal brothers and sisters. And when devastating plagues swept through Roman cities and the pagan elites fled for their lives, the Christians stayed behind to nurse the sick, even those who weren't Christian. This massive display of heroic charity dramatically increased survival rates and drew countless converts who saw something genuinely different in this community. Therefore, the movement grew exponentially. By the early 4th century, they made up roughly 10% of the empire's population. Then came the ultimate turning point, the conversion of Emperor Constantine. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing the faith. Constantine poured state funds into building churches and even gathered Christian leaders at the Council of Nicaea to unify their doctrines. And finally, in 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I made Nicene Christianity the sole official state religion of the entire Roman Empire. It's a mind-blowing historic irony, isn't it? The very empire that used the cross to publicly destroy a peasant preacher was ultimately conquered by the symbol of his execution. If there's one thing to take away from this incredible journey, it's that the early Christians didn't hide the shame of the cross. They inverted it. They took the state's ultimate weapon of terror and turned it into a badge of divine victory. The next time you see a cross, remember, you're not just looking at a religious icon, you're looking at the ultimate historical upset. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take care.